When I was 11, I went away to a summer camp called Deer Crossing in the mountains near Lake Tahoe in California. I was expecting a normal outdoor sleepaway camp. What I would later learn is that this was a very different kind of camp. But for the time being, I went away for a 2-week session. In the first week, I did typical summer camp stuff. I went canoeing, I learned how to windsurf, I went swimming, learned some first aid, did some chores, played Magic the Gathering with my new friends. And then halfway through the 2-week session, there was the campfire evening. And this evening felt a little bit weird, a little bit different. People were whispering about it. And when we were about to hike the 1/4 mile to the campfire site, the instructors told us, like, hey, make sure to check behind you when we hike out to the campfire. Just pay attention. And I was like, okay, So we hike out, we do s'mores, we do skits, and then it's super dark out. The Milky Way is splashed across the sky. And this is when I learned the deep, dark secret of Deer Crossing Camp, which is that if this is your first time attending camp, then you must walk back from the campfire to the lodge alone in the dark. This was a high tension moment for my 11-year-old self. Let me just put it mildly. And for everyone else who had to go through this ordeal, this rite of passage, it was terrifying. And the most terrifying part of this was the first few steps when we had to walk down this granite shelf and enter the forest, enter the darkness. What ended up happening is that I walked down and entered the forest and walked a little bit farther, and then I waited there, and then there was some other campers who came and did the same thing, and we clustered together, and then as a little group, we made our way down through the forest, back onto the path, and finally back to the camp lodge. It was an incredibly empowering experience, and the next day you could feel it. You could feel that everyone was standing a little bit taller because we had done the night walk. We had conquered the darkness. This was the first big adventure in my life. I later learned that this is not an adventure that's unique only to this camp. This is something that other people in other places do. And in the Netherlands, they have a tradition called dropping, in which scouting groups will be dropped. And these are people who are about the same age as I was when I went to Deer Crossing Camp. So they're around 11, 12, 13 years old. They'll be dropped out, often blindfolded first, transported out to some rural location, dropped there, and instructed to find their way back to the camp or to the home base together in the dark, often not showing up until 2 or 3 in the morning. In an article written about this tradition, they say the Dutch do childhood differently. Children are taught not to depend too much on adults. Adults are taught to allow children to solve their own problems. Droppings distill these principles into extreme form, banking on the idea that even for children who are tired, hungry, and disoriented, there is a compensatory thrill to being in charge. I love that phrase, compensatory thrill to being in charge. That is what I felt after the night walk at Deer Crossing Camp. The more research I did through the years, the more I heard a story like this repeat itself, often from people who were in leadership positions, people we might look up to. Here's one that you might have heard of before.
I came from a family with a lot of love, but my mum was determined that we stood on our own 2 feet. So from a very young age, maybe 5 or 6, she would pushed me out of the car and told me to make my own way to grandmother's house, which was maybe 3 miles away. And that's the kind of, nowadays people would say foolish thing she did, but it did help us stand on our own 2 feet. And she was incredibly supportive, lots of love, but every opportunity she had, she would push us to the limits.
So I went back to work at this summer camp, Deer Crossing, and when I went back and got to be an instructor there, something that I realized is that the risk that I perceived at the moment of the night walk was actually much more perceived risk than actual risk, because we, the instructional staff, were actually hiding along the trail that the campers were walking back on. We had departed the campfire earlier, acting as if we were going right back to camp. But instead, we were hiding at the key points where any of the campers might have gone off the trail and gotten into a real sticky situation. And so it was actually not a super high-risk situation. It felt like but it wasn't. Another thing that I ended up leading at this summer camp was a backpacking trip called the Ascent. And the Ascent was a trip that was only allowed for campers who had been to this camp before, had gone on one of the 3-day backpacking or canoe camping trips prior to this, and then they applied to be an Ascent camper. And what was different about this trip was that the campers planned everything about the trip. And so they were responsible for choosing the route, choosing when we leave to start hiking and when we take breaks and when we choose to have dinner and go to bed. They would decide pretty much everything involved in the trip, including the packing list and the food that was brought. And then 2 instructors would just trail this group and make sure that if anyone got seriously injured or they were really, really lost and they were not going to make it back, then they had an insurance policy, so to speak. And on one of these trips, I remember being woken up at 5 a.m. to go on a super long, grueling, mostly off-trail hike through the Sierra Nevada. We are arriving at our destination as the sun is setting. Everyone's tired. Everyone's hungry. I have my own stuff because I'm sort of like a ghost. I'm doing my own thing. And so I've set up my sleeping bag. I'm cooking my pot of food for dinner. And I hear the group, they're unloading their packs. And they say, okay, who's got the mac and cheese? And someone says, I got the mac and cheese. And someone says, who's got the stove? And someone else says, I've got the stove. And then they say, who's got the cooking pot? There's silence. Who's got the cooking pot? No one remembered to bring the cooking pot. They had the macaroni and cheese. They had the stove. They had the fuel. They had no way to cook the pasta. And then they looked over at me and they saw me with my little cooking pot, make my own little dinner. They said, Blake, when you're done with that, can we borrow your pot? I said, I'm sorry, you guys. I'm not really here. This is the Ascent. And they looked at each other like, oh, this is exactly what we signed up for. And they ate Cliff Bars for dinner. And did they go hungry? No. Did they figure out a way to make it work? Yes. Will any of them ever forget to bring a cooking pot on a backpacking trip again? My guess is no. These were the kind of adventures that I got baked into me pretty early in life. But these are also fairly traditional adventures. These are outdoor-focused adventures. And there was another summer camp that I started working at roughly the same time. And this is called Not Back to School Camp. The way that I ended up at Not Back to School Camp is, back when I was in college, I was studying astronomy and physics. I thought I wanted to become a PhD researcher. I learned that quantum mechanics and linear algebra were not really for me, and the life of graduate students in astrophysics was not really for me. I wanted to be outside throwing a frisbee a lot more than inside coding in a dark cave. And I pivoted, thinking maybe I'll become a high school science teacher. Then I started reading books about the American education system. I started reading books by teachers who had won awards and then quit teaching. And I realized pretty quickly that the traditional system was not going to work for me as an educator. And instead, I was going to get involved in the alternative education world. And one of the books that influenced me most in the alternative education sphere was the Teenage Liberation Handbook by a woman named Grace Llewellyn, a former teacher. And she had gone on, after quitting her teaching job, to start a summer camp called Not Back to School Camp. And so I wrote her, I got myself invited to work at this camp. And if Deer Crossing Camp was a bit more of this traditional wilderness, a bit more paternal approach, to adventure, the Not Back to School camp was a bit more of this nurturing, alternative, maternal camp with a bit of a new age twist. Let me explain. First of all, Not Back to School camp has a completely open schedule. And so if you go there as a camper, you are able to choose essentially everything you want to do throughout the day. You do need to attend 2 all-group meetings and 1 small group meeting. But this also largely applies to staff. When I went to go work there, I was told, if you're not doing anything else during the day, you can just take a nap if you're tired. And I said, I can just take a nap? I'm working here. They said, you can just take a nap, take care of yourself. I said, oh my gosh, it's a revelation. In that small group meeting that the campers have to attend every day, they did check-ins. These are like emotional-based check-ins, often using language found from the world of nonviolent communication. And so they would be challenged by someone like me, one of their small group leaders, to use very specific languages and words to describe their feelings throughout the day. And this was a challenge to like know yourself and know what you're feeling each day. And then during each day's staff meeting, I would also be checking in with my fellow staff. This was the first time anyone had asked me to do anything quite like this. So a very big growth experience for me. This is my phrase, hippie bonding activities. This camp is very good at pulling really cool activities from the outside world and bringing it into the little Not Back to School camp world. And so I don't want to ruin the surprise, but many of these evening activities, they're all optional, involve eye contact, involve hugging, involve chanting. They're incredible activities that bring groups together and that require a lot of trust and vulnerability. That's really what this camp was about. And finally, Not Back to School camp introduced me to a game that I fell in love with called Hot Seat, in which, let's say you have a group of 12 people, one person volunteers to be on the hot seat, and they are then subjected to questions for the next 3 to 4 minutes that they try their hardest to answer. And these are not boring questions like, what's your favorite color? These are, like, again, serious, high trust, high vulnerability questions that might have to do with family relationships, body image, spirituality, going all over the place. And so this was a different kind of adventure. The young adults who show up to Not Back to School camp are definitely having an adventure, but it was not like the deer crossing, outdoors, wilderness, nature, climbing mountains, walking through the darkness kind of adventure. This was an adventure that was a bit more accessible to people of all physical ability levels and was a bit more of an introspective and interpersonal adventure. I was so inspired by working for these 2 very different camps at the same time that I took my favorite elements from both of them and started my own company called Unschool Adventures. I had recently come back from South America, having my quarter-life crisis there in 2007, and was deeply inspired to return to Argentina. And I ended up creating a little travel company for teenage unschoolers or anyone else who is sympathetic to unschooling and self-directed learning. And I took a group of 9 of them to Argentina for 6 weeks. We spent 2 weeks doing homestays and Spanish language classes in Patagonia, 2 weeks of student-designed travel in which they're given a budget and some parameters, and they decide where we go, kind of like the Ascent trip. And finally, 2 weeks in Buenos Aires, living in rented apartments and learning to dance tango. And every day of this trip, we had a check-in, and we played hot seat at least a few times. And so it was a bit of Deer Crossing Camp, a bit of Not Back to School Camp, and a bit of Blake and his desire to continue experiencing South America. And Unschool Adventures has turned into this laboratory for me to play with different forms of adventure and to incentivize teenagers to try all different kinds of adventures. Some of these are the more traditional adventures, hiking. I took a group across the South Island of New Zealand in 2013, seeing how much of the width of the island we could walk on foot. I took a group to Australia. We learned to surf because that's what you do in Australia. But then we started to do stuff that was maybe not the most usual adventure stuff. For example, a group in Oregon, I took on a high ropes course, which is like for leadership and team building, where you're strapped into a rock climbing harness and you do something like climb a pole that's the same size as a electrical pole, and you stand on top and then you jump off of it into thin air. I did a writing retreat. This is one of the few programs that I repeated many times. Usually most of these programs were one-time events. But the writing retreat came about when I kept meeting all of these teens who were super interested in writing, especially writing novels, and they were really open to the idea of doing something like NaNoWriMo, which is short for National Novel Writing Month. That's something that happens in the month of November when first-time authors attempt to write 50,000 words of a first draft of their novel. And so I decided, let's get a bunch of teenagers together and some cool other staff, and let's rent a beach house in Oregon or rent out a hostel in Durango, Colorado, where this photo was taken, and get a bunch of teenagers together to each try to write their own 50,000 word first draft novels, and we can support each other along the way while kind of each doing our own thing at the same time, a kind of co-working retreat. I took a group to Nepal once, and part of that was a 10-day Tibetan Buddhism retreat in a monastery outside Kathmandu. And we had guided meditation sessions each day. Half of the day was spent in silence. And we were one of the only youth groups in this perhaps 200-person program. And so they were in this meditation hall. They were in these Buddhism discussion groups alongside all these other travelers and spiritual seekers and getting to participate like a regular traveler. I took them back to Argentina and Buenos Aires to learn more tango and to dance in milongas, which are social tango dances, again, alongside dancers and travelers of all ages and backgrounds. When I got into dancing another form of dance called fusion, I organized a program to teach that to teenagers and recruited some instructors to teach that, and we went to a fusion dance event. Again, in Argentina, I have a big thing for Argentina. I took a group of 18 to 21-year-olds to Buenos Aires and rented them 3 group apartments for 3 months. And so they were split up into groups of 4 or 5 people, but these apartments were connected to each other with easy public transport, and they had the experience of living abroad and largely doing their own thing outside of taking Spanish classes for 3 months. A number of the teens who I've worked with, because they feel so confident about their self-directed learning, have also decided not to go to college, at least not at the normal age that other people do. And so I've run a number of Unschool Adventure programs about how to navigate life without college, how you continue to feel like you're making progress, learning, creating opportunities, socializing. And there was a program in Colorado in 2015 called the Adventure Semester, in which we took this group of young people and broke them up into small groups and created little mini adventures for each group and then rotated them through the mini adventures each week. And these adventures built up from easy to more difficult to very difficult. And one of the final adventures that I gave to a group of 3 of these young people was very much like one of those Dutch dropping adventures. We were in Denver, and I put them in my car. I blindfolded them. They each had a musical instrument with them that I knew they know how to play. I drove them to Boulder, Colorado, which is about a 45-minute drive away. I made sure that they had no spending money with them. And I said, okay, your mission today, this morning, is to play your instruments, to busk, and to earn enough money to get yourself a bus ticket to get back to our hostel in Denver. And they did it, and they loved it. We did a retreat that taught real-world skills like how to deep clean a bathroom, how to change the oil in a car, how to get a credit card and not get scammed by credit card companies, how to look for, your first place where you might live with roommates. And on some of these trips, we did do some touristy stuff too. It's not all crazy adventures. Although trying to go to Machu Picchu is in itself a crazy adventure. I don't recommend it. And finally, what was integral to almost all of these trips was a heavy amount of free time for city exploration. And so this photo is actually from Berlin in 2023. On this trip, each day the group would go into Berlin to try to find how much cool stuff a city like this has to offer that costs no money or very little money. And every now and then they would do more interesting challenges. Like in this photo, Jack, who's leading the group, is taking 3 of the participants who have been blindfolded and they can't hear anything either. They've got like music on. And he was leading them across the city through public transport in this manner. And I actually don't remember what the ultimate point of this adventure was, but it was highly memorable, that's for sure. And this is what's really attractive to me about unschooling. Unschooling means many different things to many different people, but to me, it symbolizes the potential for adventure. And my favorite definition of unschooling that I've picked up is from Pat Ferenga, who is the person who has worked extensively with John Holt, who's really the father figure of the unschooling movement. And so this is Pat Ferenga's definition based upon John Holt's definition. It says, allowing your children as much freedom to explore the world around them in their own ways as you can comfortably bear. That's what unschooling is. The reason I like this definition is because it involves exploration, but these 2 key phrases, in their own ways, and as you, meaning the parent, can comfortably bear. This means that unschooling can look like many different things, depending upon who's involved, and it changes throughout time. And this is true for adventure also. So there are a few different factors that will modulate what is possible with adventure and what's possible with something like unschooling. The first one is culture. This is my friend Josine, who lives in Amsterdam, so the Netherlands. And this is a photo of her with one of her 2 young boys. And we were hanging out last year, and we walked over to an adventure playground nearby. These are pretty common in the Netherlands. And I've also seen them in Berlin. I've seen them in Denmark. It's a Western and Northern European thing predominantly, it seems. In the adventure playground, there are boards, there are nails, there are hammers. Like the tools, like the hammers or saws or anything like that, are locked up, and they're only accessible when there's an adult there to make sure that everyone is using them in the kind of appropriate way. But then the playground is just there. It's open. It's for anyone to use. And I want to show you a photo of when I went up to inspect one of these structures. This is what I saw. In case you can't see that, those are nails sticking out of planks of wood, of old pallets. And some of them are clean, silver nails, and other of them are rusty brown nails. And this is a public playground in a major city in the Netherlands. I love this. It gets better, because when we were hanging out at this playground, I witnessed, in the style of the movie Braveheart, a crowd of young boys charging another group of young boys, and each of these groups had boards with nails sticking out of them. I cannot make this up. This is real. They did not actually hit each other. It was all sort of like a dance. It was superficial. It was a play act, but really they were charging each other with boards with nails in them. This is part of the culture there. This is why this is not considered crazy or irresponsible, because something like an adventure playground or letting kids play with boards with nails sticking out of them is considered fairly standard. And maybe this goes along with the dropping type activities that we heard about earlier. So culture is one thing that modulates what's possible with adventure. And what's interesting about these countries, like the Netherlands and Germany, is that these are also the countries where things like homeschooling are either totally illegal or ambiguously legal, where it's not easy to practice that kind of alternative education. There's a lot more free-range parenting in the countries that happen to not have laws that are friendly to things like homeschooling. Another thing that determines what's possible with adventure is personality. And this is not just the personality of the young person, but the personality of the parent also. So what you're looking at is a photo of me at age 14 in Chile. And I grew up with a dad who spent a lot of time when he was young living abroad and kind of getting moved around because his dad's work took him everywhere. And he had spent some time living in Chile and also in Mexico. And he wanted me to have a similar kind of experience. He wanted me to have that opportunity. I was interested in this opportunity. My dad was interested in me having this opportunity. My mom, they were not together, but my mom was open to me having this opportunity also. So all three of our personalities lined up to make this a reasonable adventure for me at age 14. I went with an organized group. We went down to Chile. We spent 3 days doing an orientation together, and then we all got split up doing solo homestays. And I ended up staying with a family with a host brother who was a year older than me. And the first thing that this host brother did, like the first night I was there, he took me out to the local school gymnasium where a punk rock show was happening. It was this huge party. And I'm in this place within 5 minutes, and this young woman who's standing next to me beelines up to me and introduces herself as Varvala. And I'm like, oh, how exotic, Varvala. I later learned that Chileans pronounce their B's a lot like V's, and so her name was actually Barbara. And I just thought it was this very exotic Chilean name. But Varvala made me her gringo boy toy, boyfriend for a week before she summarily dumped me because I had poor Spanish and was not that interesting. But this was just one of these, the adventures just piled up on top of each other very quickly in this homestay in Chile experience. And that definitely lit the fire in me for more big international experiences pretty soon in my life. Finally, there's opportunity. This can determine what kind of adventures is possible. And the people you're looking at here, the mom is Victoria Bruce. And Victoria was raising her daughter, Emily, as a single mom and was living in Christchurch, New Zealand, and was getting really burnt out trying to do everything she was expected to do in the city life of Christchurch. And so she took an opportunity to avoid burnout and to go on a big adventure with her daughter. She sold their house, put their stuff in storage. They traveled to the north end of the North Island of New Zealand, and they started hiking south. And they spent the next 6 months hiking together on the Te Araroa, which is the trail that's kind of like the Pacific Crest Trail of New Zealand. It goes from the top of the North Island to the bottom of the South Island. And she wrote about this in a book called Adventures with Emily. And I know this because I interviewed Victoria for the podcast I've recently started called Dirtbag Rich, which profiles people like this. And so Victoria took this opportunity that could have, it could have gone the other direction and turned this into a big adventure for her and her daughter. And of course, her daughter's personality lined up with this. They already had spent a lot of time hiking together. This was not the first time that they did some sort of adventure like this. So there are lots of different ways you can think about adventure. Within these bounds of culture, personality, and opportunity, there are many little dials that can be tweaked. Of course, we usually think about adventure as travel in the outdoors. But there are also cross-cultural adventures. There are interpersonal adventures, entrepreneurial, academic, introspective. And I think that the best adventures are the ones that combine multiple of these factors. And that's what I've aspired to do with my Unschool Adventure programs. But outside of these programs, I've also gotten to hang out with a lot of cool teens. Most of them somehow alternatively educated, self-directed, neurodivergent, quirky, gloriously quirky. And then some teens who are a bit more norm and mainstream. So I want to share a few stories from these teens. One of my favorite adventures, which is totally not travel or outdoorsy, that I love to kind of inspire teenagers to work toward, is reaching out to a stranger who might be able to help you somehow. And so the story you're about to hear is from a young woman named Emma Bogish. This is a video, an interview I recorded about 10 years ago, you'll see. And she's from New Haven, Connecticut, and she was super interested. She's a homeschooler. She's super interested in Vikings. And this is the story of what she decided to do with that interest.
And then I found out that I was really interested in Vikings because we started to watch the History Channel show Vikings. And I was
Cool.
like, wow, this is
All
really
right.
cool. And so then we read your book, and so my mom was like, hey, you should probably email somebody and like see if there's anything. Yes. And so we were like researching in the area, and we found a lecture being done by one of the professors at Yale. And then I emailed his like assistant person, and I asked like,
And how did you find that assistant person?
I looked on the Yale website.
It's so simple.
Yeah.
So easy.
And I said, like, hey, can I come to this lecture? Because this is something I'm really interested in. And guess what? In June of this year, I went to London. And I went to the British Museum. And I saw all of the Viking exhibit. And I saw the largest ship they've ever found. And this is, like, something I really think is really awesome.
And you mentioned that you were not a Yale student.
Right,
You
yeah,
were
that I was
16,
homeschooled.
homeschooled.
Yeah,
Not
and they were super excited about it because like I was like the first homeschool student who had ever approached them, and like people are really open to having you come in. And I went to the lecture and I met him. We talked about his book. I asked questions, and then I asked if there were any other resources or if he was teaching any classes. And then he said, you know what? Actually, next semester I'm starting a class. You're welcome to come and audit it. And now I actually just went to get the books today.
So the punchline there is 16-year-old homeschoolers interested in Vikings because she watched the Vikings TV show and goes to a Yale professor and says, hey, I see you have a class about Vikings. Can I come sit in on it? And the professor's like, sure. And this is because this young woman, Emma, was able to reach out in a confident, kind of seemingly professional way and tell her story and say, hey, I'm super curious about the thing that you are super passionate about. Can I just sit in? I don't need credits. I'm not trying to do this for any other reason. And an academic who maybe is constantly dealing with freshmen who are just there for credit, is probably feeling pretty good when you have this total external person coming in and saying, I love what you do. And so she was allowed to sit in on a Yale class about Vikings and was given this professor's book as a gift. Incredible. Simply by virtue of reaching out and asking. A similar story that I chronicle in my book, Why Are You Still Sending Your Kids to School?, is about Jonah Meyer, who was hating school so much he dropped out in middle school and he just wanted to rock climb. And he just rock climbed for about 2 years. He probably made his parents pretty nervous because he wasn't doing anything else that looked like traditional progress. He joined an organization called North Star, which is a self-directed learning center, which is very autonomy supportive. There's very little that's required of you. And he was browsing the North Star library and he found a book about general science and he got kind of interested in chemistry. He ended up pursuing this interest in a very self-directed way. And realized that to take it to the next level, he should probably go and actually take a class in chemistry. But instead of going to high school to do that, he set his sights on the local university, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And with the help of his parents, he drafted an email to a chemistry professor of introduction to chemistry and said, hey, I'm Jonah, I'm a middle school dropout, but I'm super interested in chemistry, and I'd love to take your class, and I don't need any credits for it, I just want to sit in on it, and maybe you could let me take the tests, and you could grade them, but again, I don't need credits. How many emails like this do you think this professor gets in a year, or a lifetime? Zero. That's my guess. And so Jonah was allowed to audit the chemistry course, did not get credit for it, but did get a bit of like a letter of reference afterwards from the professor who said, this kid's cool. If he wants to audit your course, you should probably let him do it. That's an adventure too. Imagine the excitement of reaching out to someone who might seem otherwise kind of untouchable, like a college professor, and getting a direct response and making a request, and that person says yes. Yes. I actually just got an email today from a teenager who took an online course I created called Emailing Strangers. And I was told that this teenager is still using these skills to this day, years later. Warmed my heart. Finally, one of my favorite stories, which is in my first book, College Without High School, is about Jenny Bowen, unschooler from Wichita, Kansas, who had some exotic white mice that got sick, and she took them to Wichita's only exotic animal clinic and hit it off with the veterinarian. And on the way out, Jenny's mom suggested that maybe she should ask the veterinarian if there's some sort of opportunity for her there. So Jenny did ask the veterinarian and was able to start volunteering at the vet's office, doing basic stuff in the front of the office, and eventually got invited to come back and to shadow operations, to see skunks getting descented or rabbits getting neutered, and got to be like the full assistant at a tiny veterinary clinic. She went on to create a bicycle-powered smoothie stand, which is featured in this photo. So this is a combination of entrepreneurial and interpersonal adventure. Thank you, Jenny. Back in the realm of more conventional adventure, travel and outdoor, about a year ago, this time, I was on a cycling adventure with two friends in Patagonia, in Chile, on the Carretera Austral, which is this 1,000-kilometer partially paved highway through some of the most beautiful parts of southern Chile. And my friends and I did the Carretera from south to north. Most people do it the other way. They go from north to south because it's easier and more paved and less vertical up in the north. And down in the south, it's like bad gravel and lots of up and down. It's pretty hardcore. But when we were starting out our trip, when we were in that hardcore section, one of the first groups of other cyclists who we met who were going south was a French family with 4 kids. And 3 of these kids were on their own bicycles. One was on the back of the parents' bicycle. But these kids were not that old. They looked like they were somewhere between 9 and 13 years old. And they were out there. And this is like a pretty wild area where if something bad happens, you have to be pretty self-sufficient. And they seemed like they had they'd reached this point where they were a well-oiled, functional bicycling family. And we didn't even exchange any words. They went off in the other direction. But of course, first, before they went north, they went south. The 2 parents, before they started cycling, pulled out some like e-cigarettes and took a long drag on their e-cigarettes. And I said, that's so French. Wow. And then you go cycling. So there are families out there that are doing these kinds of adventures together. A lot of them call themselves world schoolers. I've met other cycling families in Portugal, for example. There are many families that are not doing hardcore outdoor stuff. They're just living abroad and getting to know local areas and then migrating to another place. So that is another form of adventure that combines multiple factors. And then one of my all-time favorite stories, this is from a cycle trip, again, that I was on just for myself in 2021. I was cycling from Germany to Portugal, and I was staying with a couch surfing host in the south of France. And at the same host, unbeknownst to me, were 2 other couch surfers, 2 other cyclists, who were 2 19-year-old German young women who had started the trip in the north of Germany, and they were going to Barcelona. And as soon as I met them and I heard how they were traveling, I said, I need to interview you for my podcast immediately. And so right there on the couch of this couch surfing host, I interviewed Lily and Elena about their gap year cycling trip at age 19. And I want to play you a little excerpt from that interview.
Today we're in Montélimar at a couch surfing host. And we're staying some night at couch surfing hosts, but we also have a tent with us, so we can also stay in camping places, or we also asked people to camp in their garden, but that's much easier in Germany than in France.
Yeah, because our problem is that we don't speak French, and the most French people don't speak English or German, so it's very hard to ask them if we like strangers can camp in their garden. But we will see, maybe we will have luck one day. And in Germany it worked out very well, so it was one of the nicest experiences, that total strangers let us camp in their gardens and gave us food and so much love, like, yeah, we haven't thought before.
So it's been all positive experiences on this trip?
Yes, really, really positive.
Yeah, especially how nice people are. That was really, really, yeah.
They were cycling and asking people they met along the way if they could camp in their gardens. And often these people said, please come stay inside in our guest room or on our couch, and please let us feed you dinner and breakfast. And they had so much success with this that they were only spending about 10 euros a day on food. That was Lily and Elena's gap year adventure through Europe at age 19. And I want to say, this is definitely not for everyone. You know, this is a fairly high level of risk. It's in the same category as hitchhiking, I think. But the combination of culture and personality and opportunity for them made this a very reasonable form of adventure. And I think gap years in general are wonderful vehicles for pulling adventure into the life of a young adult who's in the post-high school, pre-college range. It's just something that we all sort of like. We're like, oh yeah, take a gap year. So I want to conclude with 3 principles for inviting adventure into your family, a bit of practical do this advice. The first one is to start early and to start small. And that's why one of the articles that I recommended for this presentation was something called 81 Adventure Challenges for Young People, which is available on my website. And these are a bunch of tiny little adventures that you can do with younger kids. You can do it with younger teenagers. For example, pick a daily newspaper, read every single word, underline as you read, or remain silent for a full day. Apprentice yourself to a neighbor or a family friend for a day. Attend someone else's place of worship. Make comparisons to your own. This is a way to get adventure into the bones pretty early as a family. And I would like to think of this as developing a bias towards action and experimentation. As soon as there's an opportunity to try something like this, you just go for it. You just try it and see what happens. And with that momentum, bigger things begin to become possible. My second piece of advice is to go online in order to go offline. You might have seen this guy before. He is the creator of really great YouTube videos. I want to play a brief clip from one of his videos.
This is a bird feeder, and everything to my left is my attempt at making it squirrel-proof. If they want the bird seed, they will first need to pass through what is basically an 8-part Ninja Warrior obstacle course for squirrels. This course is extremely challenging. It is not for the timid of heart. But out of the gate, I will admit that in hindsight, that I completely underestimated my adversary. Now, if you're wondering why, so he goes with a different. It's right here. This is the only platform on the catapult. It's a squirrelapult.
Yeah, Mark is really good at making these backyard DIY kind of create an obstacle course type videos. And this is what I tell myself when I get embroiled in these debates about screen time and internet and what's appropriate and what's not, is that there are really cool, inspiring people out there on the internet that make me want to go do things in real life. And as long as I can find those people and I can focus on them, I am doing something good on the internet. And it was actually an online video, an old YouTube video that inspired me to get into partner dancing in the first place, which has become a very big part of my adult life. There was an old video showing Lindy Hop dancers, and when I watched this, my jaw dropped, and I still drop my jaw every time I play this video. That is what the internet is good for. So I'm a big fan of using online resources to inspire offline adventures. Finally, and the more complicated one, is to lead the way and then get out of the way. I think that with adventures with younger kids, it's often pretty clear how to initiate an adventure. And often it means being a sort of high energy, charismatic adult who makes things happen. Here's an example that doesn't have anything to do with unschooling. It's all about just creating an adventure with enthusiasm.
Remember being in a bike gang when you were a kid? Well, every Wednesday morning in the Portland Public School District,
let's get some bells going!
a small trickle of bikes forms around 8 a.m.
When I say bike, you say bus! Bike! Bike!
They call it the bike bus, and as it begins to flow through the neighborhood, it gathers strength.
So there's a teacher that organizes this, and my hat is off to this teacher. It's wonderful. My question is, what happens when these young kids become a little bit older? How do you inspire adventures, and how do you not get in the way of adventures? And this is where I'm going to come back to that summer camp, Deer Crossing, that I went to at age 11, because I told you this was a different kind of camp. And what I would later learn is that this camp was very serious about leading with attitude and leading with language. And something you learned when you hiked into Deer Crossing Camp is that you are not allowed to bring in your Tanaki monster. Tanaki is T''Naci. That is the phrase "I can't" spelled backwards. And so there's this elaborate kind of rhetorical game that was played at this camp in which whenever anyone said "I can't," even by honest mistake, other people who had been to this camp before would say, "Excuse me, you what?" And you would be encouraged to, instead of saying "I can't," to say Tanaki, this sort of silly phrase, or "I choose not to recognize that you are making a choice, or best, "I could if I." And so through this camp, we were taught that this phrase "I can't" is kind of a cage that locks certain possibilities out of our life, and that there's a key that opens this cage, and that is the phrase "I could if I." And the longer you hung around this camp, the more you learned that there were all these other cages in our language and in our thinking, and there were keys that could unlock them. This was shown through the teen leadership program at the camp, and it's also something I learned when I went back to work there. And it was incredibly useful for me in my early 20s to have this framework instilled in my head. And this is something that you can do as a family starting pretty early, which is for example, make a game out of not saying the phrase "I can't." Sometimes this game can involve little things like money or coins. There are other ways to do it. But one way or another, this is a way to start leading in a more subtle way, and in a way that can kind of get form a little undercurrent that leads to this desire to have adventures, and not this automatic rejection or shutting off of anything that sounds hard or uncomfortable. Another way to lead in this sense is to lead with joy. And one of my favorite books, I'm not a parent, but I've read a lot of parenting books, and one of my all-time favorites is called The Idle Parent by Tom Hodgkinson. And this is a pretty good book for anti-helicopter parenting, anti-snowplow parenting, anti-drone parenting. There's lots of different phrases for this now. And just being a laid-back parent who is like really quite happy with your own life, and kids see that and they relax too. One of my favorite quotes from this book is that there's nothing so corrosive as resentment stewing in the breast. There's no room for martyrs in the world of the idle parent. Our happiness comes first, and that is the right way round. As a cab driver said to me the other day of his kids, "They're happy because we're happy. Do not suffer. Enjoy your life." This is a form of leading, and also getting out of the way, of not lecturing, of not directly instructing, but showing that you too can have adventures. And this doesn't have to be some huge adventure. You don't have to go cycling through Patagonia to do this. This could be you as a parent signing up for a dance class and coming home sweaty and beaming. This could be you deciding to host couch surfers at your house, kind of like Lily and Elena, travelers through a country. And they can come and stay in a guest room or sleep on a couch for a night and share their stories with your kids. This can look lots of different ways. Whenever you're a parent, of course, family is a default part of that adventure, and that will shape what is possible for these other kinds of adventure and maybe make these other kinds of adventure a bit smaller. As someone who has decided not to have kids at this point, I've been able to dedicate a lot of my time and my resources to going on adventures because for me, these are super necessary for me to feel alive and to feel vibrant. And they're really helpful also in my work with young people. They're good for my credentials, so to speak. But the credential is my spirit. So adventures of this sort are not required, I think, to have a sense of adventure in your own family. And I am definitely biased, and I am definitely obsessed. Don't do as I do necessarily. But I would like to conclude by saying we all need adventure in our own ways. Parents, kids, family members, and people who are not parents too. And let's just keep in mind that kind of like unschooling, we do adventures in our own ways, and we do them as much as our loved ones can comfortably bear. Big adventures are fine, small adventures are fine, traditional looking ones are great, and ones that don't seem at first glance like adventures at all are totally welcome too. Thanks for coming to my presentation.